when Faris Shahabi brought up the point, you know what, your 300,000 starving civilians in Aleppo, it was half that number, and they were starving because the terrorists kept all the food. He kept bringing up these points, and eventually Krishnendra Murthy, the journalist of Channel 4, said, Faris Shahabi, let's not get into history. Literally, it's on my Facebook. I loved it so much. And so this is how they do it. They tell lies, they ram it in your faces, and then when they're exposed, they either just shut up and pretend it never happened, or they start attacking the people who've exposed them. Another lie you might be aware of is this darling boy named Amran Dakmish. Amran Dakmish, the ambulance boy, the dusty boy, the boy in the ambulance. So the basic story was that this cute boy, age, I forget now, 6 or 7, was badly injured in a Russian or Syrian airstrike on his home in August 2016. When I was in Aleppo in June 2017, I asked, hey, is that family here? Because I've heard perhaps he is. And to be honest, I was told no. But I really kept asking and fighting and saying, look, I've heard he's here, can I please try to interview him? And that same day, his father, Mohammed Dakmish, decided he would break his silence and speak to the media. And the reason he had not spoken to the media thus far is that he had been exploited. His son had been exploited by the media. But he finally decided to speak to Syrian media, and the second day I got to interview him. And his story was no, there was no airstrike. The terrorists kept trying to pressure me into corroborating their accusations, but I'm not going to corroborate something I did not see. There was no airstrike. There was a blast, most likely fired by terrorists onto the neighborhood, because that neighborhood was known to be supportive of the government. And his son Amran was taken in the commotion and stuck in an ambulance, not administered first aid, just stuck there and photographed and videoed, and then sent off to a hospital. But the real story was that Amran Dakmish had mild injuries from bits of rubble that fell. They all had mild injuries, but there was no dramatic airstrike. And this boy was used. He was the icon of suffering in Syria. This was literally what people were saying about him. But these same journalists, like the CNN anchor who cried for Amran, or Christiane Amanpour, who wove a photo of Amran in the face of, I think it was Sergei Lavrov, they haven't gone to Aleppo and met the father. You know what they have done instead? Oh, well, he was coerced into saying what he said. And this is the arrogant attitude of colonial media. In cities like Tartus or Latakia or Damascus, you can meet internally displaced people from all over Syria. There are millions of internal refugees, and the majority of those are being housed by the Syrian government and being given health care by the Syrian government. But when someone like me goes to these areas, or specifically when someone like me goes and collects testimonies from Syrians from around the country who might be in Tartus, who might be in Latakia, who might be in Damascus, who might be in Aleppo, these testimonies are, the corporate media writes them off as irrelevant, insignificant, you know, you didn't go to the opposition side. And I often jest that I don't go to the so-called opposition side because I prefer to have my head attached to my neck. But the reality is, even corporate media journalists I think as Patrick Coburn noted, that journalists cannot go in there unless specifically they're embedded with Al-Qaeda. It is a real lethal risk if you're going to go and report on the Al-Qaeda side. And now I'm not afraid of danger, but my main reason for not going there is I see no reason to give them more validation than the corporate media already does. And the voices of these millions of Syrians in government-secured areas need to be heard. Because even though they're in areas that are not occupied by Al-Qaeda and other terrorists, they're still subject to terrorism. In Damascus, again, the number of civilians killed just through terrorist attacks was something like 13,000. According to the chief coronary, what's the proper term? I forget the proper term. Anyway, his name is Zahar, Dr. Zahar. And civilians in Damascus were subject to mortar and missile terrorism on a daily basis for years. And I spent quite a bit of time in the old city of Damascus when I wasn't going around the country. And these mortars were all the time and very close. And they specifically chose hours when children were going to and from school in order, just like the Israelis, to ensure maximum casualties. And I can give you one account where a BBC journalist, who happens to be a Canadian, Lise Doucet, was at the same hospital I was at in April 2014, We saw the same children that were injured and maimed by a terrorist mortar. And I did a very simple report saying these children were injured in an attack on Minar School, 60 were injured, 1 was killed, here's video of all these kids. Lise Doucet said, it's believed that the government shelled the area, kind of thing. And if you talk to any citizen living there, they will tell you, no, the terrorists are shelling us all the time. And that's why, fast forward to some more propaganda, when Ghouta was being liberated earlier this year, we saw a recycling of the war propaganda that we heard about Aleppo. So we were told that civilians are starving in Ghouta. We were told that all sorts of crazy accusations about what the Syrian government was doing to people in Ghouta. Well, in fact, when Ghouta was liberated, I went there, and indeed civilians were starving, just like they were starving in Madaya, where I also went. But again, just like Aleppo, the reason they were starving is because Jaish al-Islam, Faylaq al-Rahman, Al-Qaeda in Syria all took control of any of the food that came into the area or that already existed. I said, what about your farmlands? Because Ghouta is surrounded by agricultural fields. They couldn't access them. And not only that, of course, when I went to Ghouta, I went to Douma, and this brings us to another propaganda point that's been used over and over throughout the years, that the Syrian government has allegedly used chemical weapons against its people. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the geography, but Ghouta is just a couple of kilometers away from Damascus. A few kilometers, like Jobar, the closer point, is literally a kilometer away from Damascus. And it is from Jobar that a lot of these mortars were being fired onto civilian areas of Damascus. But anyway, regarding this chemical allegation in April 2018, we were told that again, this crazy Syrian government again chose to use chemical weapons at a time when the Syrian army was militarily making advances by conventional means, and knowing full well that this would bring on the wrath of the West, just when they allegedly used chemical weapons in August of 2013, a year to the date, I believe, after Obama's Red Line speech. And on the eve of chemical weapons inspectors coming into Syria, the crazy Syrian leader decided he would use chemical weapons, because that's a wise thing to do when you know the whole world is ready to attack you for such an incident. In any case, now I'm going to give a shout out to independent media, it's particularly Mint Press News. It's an American-based, Chicago-based website, which I also contribute to. And they were the first that I'm aware of that actually sent reporters to the area in question in eastern Ghouta and got testimonies from civilians and from fighters saying, particularly the fighters saying, we had these weapons that Bin Salman, I think, the Saudis sent to us. We didn't know how to use them. They had chemical weapons. And there's a lot of other, of course, more official documentation of how and why there wasn't a chemical attack in eastern Ghouta in 2013. But in Douma, when I went there this year, in April, late April, I went to the medical facility where allegedly people have been treated, and I was told by medical staff there, we saw no signs whatsoever of anyone having been exposed to a nerve or chemical agent. None of the physical signs that would normally have been present. Furthermore, they had no protective gear. So even assuming that the victims they were treating had been exposed to sarin or some other nerve agent, would that not have impacted on the hospital staff? And I asked him, I said, nobody was injured because there was no chemical attack. And when I went around Douma talking to civilians, I of course asked them, and they're like, no, but let me tell you how awful life was under Jaish al-Islam. And they talked about public executions by sword, or public execution, just point-blank assassination. And do you think our media talked about that? I'm going to skip forward, I'm aware I should wrap up, but I just want to note, this is from an article I wrote before Ghouta was liberated, and I was talking about not only the propaganda we were hearing in the corporate media, but their sources. So, I mean, I'm sure you've heard my speech at the UN where I mean that most sources people are relying on are the white helmets that are created and funded by the West, work in terrorist areas, etc., stand on dead bodies of Syrian soldiers. But in this particular article, I was looking at articles, for example, in the New York Times. And this is about an area in Ghouta, I forget where. And they cited this guy, Mohammed Adel. He was one of their sources. And so I checked him out, like, all right, what's this guy like? Oh, his Facebook profile says his superhero name would be Zahran Allouche. Zahran Allouche was the leader of Jaish al-Islam. This was the man who thought it was a good idea to put Syrian civilians in cages and put them on rooftops and on trucks and use them as human shields. So this guy, his superhero name was this terrorist, and this is one of New York Times sources for how bad it was in Ghouta due to the evil Syrian government. One other source, a guy named Qusay Noor, also loved Jaish al-Islam and the other terrorist group there, Faylaq al-Rahman. And another guy who was a photographer, again, I looked at his Facebook page, Amr al-Mohabani, he also was praising Jaish al-Islam. All these people that the journalists were relying on for their accurate information are affiliated to or supportive of the terrorist groups. Do you think they're going to be giving objective information? No. So, right now in Idlib, we have a hotbed of Al-Qaeda terrorists. The number of terrorists there is not known. I've heard estimates from 70,000 to 100,000. I can't corroborate any of those, but it is known that every time an area was liberated, along with the military campaigns to liberate the area, there are also political campaigns, reconciliations. And basically these reconciliations are one of the most humane ways to enable civilians to return to their lives, because that's literally what they're offered. All right, you took an arm up against us, you can, swear, I don't know the exact details, but you swear to lay down your weapon and not do it anymore, you go back to your life. And when I interviewed the Minister of Reconciliation in 2014, already over 80,000 people had taken reconciliation. But aside from that, it also means that's that much less fighting that's going to occur in this area to liberate the area. So the Syrians, not the foreign terrorists, because of course there are many, many foreign terrorists in Syria, but the Syrians that were holding weapons had the option of taking reconciliation or getting on a bus, usually green, and heading to Idlib. And so that's why, every area like Ghouta and then Dara and other areas in the countryside, when they were liberated, numbers of terrorists did opt to go to Idlib or Jarablus. And so now in Idlib you have all these terrorists, but the focus on Idlib in corporate media is, I believe they're saying